don't think there's ever been a moment when rain has given so much shine to us as perhaps today. I'm going to offer a reflection. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge something in this mix. A mentor of mine from the conservation movement shared with me once that when he got into sort of a heated disagreement about something with his spouse, that they each could pause the other in the middle and say, "Is that a WTOP?" And the other one had to stop and reflect for a moment. And WTOP meant, is that a well thought out position? They found that helped them in their partnership for decades. So I will freely acknowledge that this perhaps is not a WTOP. So I read the Wall Street Journal every morning. The reporting is good. I think the analytical pieces are challenging, and the editorials, well, those simply infuriate me. That plus some caffeine gets my blood going every day. I know I'm alive. They take Sundays off, which I like too. It gives me some peace. So I met a new friend through a Wall Street Journal book review not long ago. It's not a friend, but if you love inspirational autobiographical writing, I think you know what I mean. James Rebanks is his name. He's a farmer and a shepherd in Northwest England. His books, Shepherd's Life and Pastoral Song, trace his journey from growing up in a farming family in the land of Beatrix Potter, that's England's famous Lake District, to a young man and then a husband and father. He struggles to navigate making a life on a small farm on difficult terrain, while farms change everywhere around him, transforming from those in the stories of Potter's Peter Rabbit to the industrial scale agricultural commodity factories that dominate our landscapes today. I have come to understand that farming, he writes toward the end of the second book, even in the traditional ways, always has costs for the natural world. It is usually a downgrade on what might be there if humans weren't. But once we accept that, we can also see that good farmers do more than produce commodities. Through benign inefficiency or good stewardship, their farms can allow a great many wild things to live in and around them, holding water that would otherwise flow off the land and flood villages, towns, and cities, and storing carbon that would otherwise alter the global climate. A good farm has a public value that transcends the pitiful price the farmer gets paid for his products. I love this summation of his land ethic. A good farmer gives more to our collective human and natural good than he or she ever receives in payment. But the part I really love is the phrase he gets to about how a farmer goes about doing this good for us all. He says it is through benign inefficiency or good stewardship. Why did he say both things? Benign inefficiency or good stewardship? Given his broader point, aren't they the same thing? For me, good stewardship is the more familiar concept. I've worked in the conservation movement most of my life, and I think in Rebanks's mind, it would be a thread running through the writings of Aldo Leopold in Sand County Almanac or Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. We have a responsibility as humans, the apex beings on this planet, to understand science, the implications of our actions, and then to act individually and together to prevent or even undo harm humans inflict on the interconnected web of life. It's how I've thought of living into our seventh principle. Okay, but what then is benign inefficiency and how is that different? From a farmer's perspective, I don't think Rebanks means neglect or sloppiness. If that were the case, it would simply be inefficiency. So if benign inefficiency is as much an intentional action as good stewardship is, then what's that difference? So I think it might be this. Good stewardship is both the goal and for him or for me, the familiar and favored approach to that goal. And I think benign inefficiency is knowing the goal, but not knowing the path to get there. Allowing it to be revealed but also to be very present and engaged with its revealing. So as I think about right relations with ourselves or with nature, for me, I will try to be thinking more about benign inefficiency, showing up in spaces where I believe in our joint goal, but being much more open that my preferred way of charting that path to the goal may not be the best or work best for everyone, may not be efficient for me. I've frequently been in city council meetings where I have agreed with the speaker, but completely wrote them off because of how they were speaking. Well, my ways aren't working great these days to get to the goals I believe in. Maybe it's time for me to see myself less as practicing good stewardship in my community and more to being open to what I may see or perceive as inefficiency, but supporting different leadership to unspool different paths. And maybe that gets us to a different outcome. But I'm still going to be enraged by the Wall Street Journal editorials.
Well, continuing with the theme of this sermon or the service, this is going to be another not very well thought out position. So God said to Noah, if you don't follow the covenant, I am going to send a great flood. No, that's a different service. The opening words are Adrienne Marie Brown, the Black writer, feminist. These are her words. When we are engaged in acts of love, we humans are at our best and most resilient. The love and romance that makes us want to be better people. The love of children that makes us want to change our whole lives to fulfill their needs. The love of family that makes us drop everything to take care of them. The love of community that makes us work tirelessly with broken hearts. If love were the central practice of a new generation of organizers and spiritual leaders, it would have a massive impact. If the goal was to increase love rather than the winning or dominating a constant opponent, I think we could actually imagine liberation from constant oppression. We wouldn't suddenly see everything we do, everyone we meet, not through the tactical lens of war, but through the eyes of love. We would see that there's no such thing as a blank canvas, an empty land, or a new idea. But everywhere there is complex, ancient, fertile ground full of potential. We would understand that the strength of our movement is the strength of our relationships, which can only be measured by their depth. We would understand that the strength of our movement is the strength of our relationships, which can only be measured by their depth. Those are the words of Adrienne Marie Brown. You hear that idea of measuring our relationships by the strength of their depth. What does that really mean? I mean, how do you measure your relationships? Do you measure it by the number you have? Do you measure the closeness they have? What if we measured our relationships by their depth? And that's what I'd really like to explore in today's service. And I hear a lot of things, and I get a little bit frustrated. Chris gets frustrated about the New York Times. I get a bit frustrated about many of the comments I hear of people my age about younger people. They're talking about teenagers. Like, it seems that teenagers is one of the few groups of people that it's okay to make fun of. And as a father of the teenager, I am both guilty and condemn that act. And we talk about real relationships, where we've got pandemic relationships and online relationships, but they're not real relationships. And I'm like, really? Why are they not real relationships? Because we don't meet in person. As you all know, you hired me, you gave me a job without ever meeting me. Did we not have a real relationship? It was probably a tentative relationship, but it was not a full real relationship in those terms. And I know there's people I have through Facebook that I've never met in real life. My friends, as Facebook calls them. But I have a real relationship with some of these people. And of course, I live 6,000 miles away from my home country, and I have relationships with people there that I maybe don't only see every couple of years, every 3 or 4 years, or maybe it's people from my past from 30 years ago, but I still have a strong relationship with those people, even if I don't see them in person. So I think we need to really think about this idea of what's the depth of a relationship, and I don't think it's just time. And we're talking about right relationship, and I always like to present the question whenever right relationship comes up. Would you rather be right, or would you rather be in relationship? Would you rather be right, or would you rather be in relationship? Because they're not inclusive necessarily. And I know, like, I think Chris, he's got a tentative relationship with Wall Street Journal, I think. I'm not sure it's a right relationship. But, it's that idea, and I always kind of err, and I'd rather be kind than be right. And I'd rather explore things from a place of curiosity rather than judgment. So I think this idea of being right is overrated. And being right-wing is vastly overrated, in my opinion. But when we really talk about right relationship, let's talk about how do we go for depth of relationship, perhaps might be more meaningful than right relationships. And one of our worship themes for this month is this idea of cultivating relationships. It's a theme, and it's an interesting term, cultivating relationships, because cultivating, as Chris was alluded to in his reflection, it's about agriculture. It's when I hear of cultivating, it's what do we need to do? You disturb the soil, you plant things, you water it, you care for it. And that's what we think of cultivation. And it's an interesting thing that with cultivation, you need to break the soil before you plant. So if you really want to cultivate relationships, what does that mean? And I think, those of us, I probably shouldn't say this with Natalie being present, but I've often found when we have argued, we've strengthened our relationship. Anyone else have that experience? No one's admitting it here. So how about in Zoom? Anyone that find that strengthens relationships when you maybe have an argument? But it always depends on how you argue. Because, there's that end when you start attacking the person rather than what they're saying, that can really fracture relationships. But if you can really stay in relationship and really try and explore gently and hear the other person. We always think about arguing is about talking, but arguing should really be more about listening and finding out where can we connect together. But I think when I hear the term right relationship or depth of relationships, and think of cultivation, I think we're trying to cultivate meaning through our relationships. We're trying to find authenticity, and we're trying to find caring, honest, challenging, affirming, and fun relationships. And sometimes we have to cultivate fun. And Unitarian Universalism, I think we forget that we've really put relationship at the center of our religion, because we actually came from the liberal wing of two Christian traditions. And we kind of removed this idea of the Christian idea of the personal relationship with Jesus or the personal relationship with God. I think most Unitarians have moved away from that, though some of us probably do have that. But what did we replace that with? And I think we replaced it with that relationship. And I would say it was with three things. It's relationship with self, relationship with other people, and relationship with the universe, with the environment, with the planet. And I want to explore those relationships. I think we put those to the center of our religion, and that's the center of Unitarian Universalism. And the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said that a religious community is defined by its relationship to the center. The points of the circle are defined relative to the center of the circle through the radii, not the points of the circumference on it. And so I think we come here, we don't just come here on a Sunday because we're in the same place. That does not define us as a religious community. What defines us is the shared values we have. And in Unitarian Universalism, I think we're a community of shared values and differing beliefs. And that's what brings us together as a community. It's not about beliefs. And that's what makes us a covenantal religion rather than a creedal religion. Many Christian traditions and many religions have a profession of faith. I mean, the most common one in Christianity is Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And so there's a personal relationship there with Jesus. But what we don't have that. We're a covenantal relationship. It's about the promises we make towards one another. And covenant's got a history in the Jewish tradition. That's where covenant was least documented in written form. And there's a relationship between the Jewish understanding of God and the Jewish people. And the covenant is a two-way promise. It's not like I promise you to do this. It's a promise we make to one another. And I think at the center of Unitarian Universalism is the promises we want to make of how we wish to be with one another. And it's not about belief. It's about, in covenant, it's not just about hope. It's an aspirational agreement we have of how we wish to be with one another. And the important thing about covenant is we agree to be in covenant, but there's a rather really important element is we also agree to be brought back into covenant because we're going to break it. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, says human beings are promise-making, promise-breaking, promise-renewing people. Promise-breaking, promise-making, promise-renewing people. And I'm really good at the promise-breaking part. And this covenant is like an agreement of how we wish to travel together, how we wish to walk together in relationship. And I think that's an important aspect of, we talk a lot about walking together, but when we're in conflict or disagreement, it's so easy to kind of walk away from that. What would it mean when we're in those difficult circumstances, in those bitter disagreements, when we're just infuriated with someone else? Can we walk towards them? Can we take a step towards them when we're in relationship? It's not easy, but that's what our covenant calls us to do, because sometimes we call others back into covenant. Sometimes we need to be called back into covenant. It's a lot more fun to call others back into covenant than being called back into it. But covenant's not something to hit people over the head with. Covenant is about a relationship. How can we gently coax people back into covenant? How can we be open to being coaxed back into covenant? And that's what the covenantal religion is about. And don't ever for a moment think Unitarian Universalism is easy. It's a lot easier to have a belief than to do the work of relationship of being in covenant. But covenant can also challenge, support, and inspire one another. And our covenant here at UUFRC is we support, challenge, and inspire one another. We assume best intentions even when we disagree and treat each other with compassion and respect. We give generously of our time, resources to sustain this vibrant fellowship. We talk about vision and mission a lot, but that's the covenant that we have here at UUFRC. We assume best intentions even when we disagree and treat each other with compassion and respect. That's a covenant that we agree with one another. And one of the things I said to this congregation in a video that I did with John Anning when I was candidating was that it's important that we can be honest in our relationships and authentic and provide positive, constructive, criticisms to one another. I think that's an important part of relationship. It kind of goes into the disagreement. That can only strengthen a relationship when you can give that honest feedback to people. With my previous congregation, one that I've met with the president one time, and he said, well, you should never criticize volunteers. So I was listening to that and said, well, if that's true, that means the only people you get criticized is staff. That doesn't seem fair. We get paid to get criticized. I mean, I think an honest, authentic relationship is like when someone does something, you can say, when you did that, I'm disappointed. I think that's a healthy part of a relationship. And it can be done lovingly. It does not need to be a bat to hit people over the head. It can really be, I'd like to bring you back into a relationship because I feel we're struggling here. So I think that's an important part that covenant allows us to have those honest, authentic, and sometimes difficult conversations with one another, but we agree through a covenant to stay in relationship through that. Reverend Lisa Ward, Unitarian Universalist minister, said, a covenant is not a definition of relationship, it's a framework for relating. A covenant leaves room for change and chance and evolution. This calls for a level of trust, courage, and sacrifice that needs to be nurtured, needs to be renewed, and affirmed on a regular basis. Those are the words of Reverend Lisa Ward. For me, the important aspect of covenant is it's an expression of the quality of the relationship we want, the depth of the relationship we want with one another. It can be a quality of relationship with close family. It can be with distant relatives. It can be within this community, or it can even be with complete strangers. I don't know if many of you, a few years ago, there was a fabulous story in The Moth. I don't know if any of you listened to The Moth podcast where people tell stories. And Auburn Sandstrom tells this story. And she, in 1992, she was struggling. She was a drug addict. And she had a young child. And she was in an abusive relationship with her boyfriend. And she was, by her own admittance, was a mess. She was not sure how she was going to survive, and she was getting really, really low in her life. And her mother was very worried about it, but she'd been estranged from her mother for about 3 years, but her mother would keep sending her notes like, call this number, I'm really worried about you. And she was sitting at 2 a.m, and she saw this number, and she was really feeling really desperate. So she called this number and was talking, and the person answered the phone, and 2 a.m. You could see the person was in bed and was kind of answering, what do you want? And the person started talking. I heard this number and I was told I could call it because I think I need help. So they started talking, and the person was really empathetic and listened, and they ended up talking for 4 hours. And this man was just listening to him. And the woman thought she was calling this Christian counsel hotline. And after 4 hours, the person said, the woman, Auburn, said, I wanted to say, you've been so helpful, thankful. I was really skeptical when I called this Christian counsel hotline that was going to be any use to me, but you've been incredibly helpful. And the person on the other end said, well, please don't hang up when I tell you this, but you got a wrong number. But I could tell that you needed some help and you needed someone to listen to, so I just listened. And Auburn says, she was so appreciative. She didn't hang up, and he talked for a little more, and then she hung up. But then she realized she didn't know what number she called, so she could never get back in touch with that person. I think that's a fabulous story, because sometimes we think we need to have depth or quality of relationship with someone we know really well. And that was an example. I mean, that was possibly life-saving. It was certainly life-affirming for Auburn. And so you just realize that these possibilities that when we call, every relationship is an opportunity to go deep. And sometimes it can feel too much. We're not in the mood for it. We're not in the energy, but that person took the time to do that. But it takes two to create a deep relationship. You can't do it with one person. Walking up to someone saying, I want a deep relationship with you, we'd probably send them running in the opposite direction. But the other thing is listening is such an important part of that. And we've talked about this in our pastoral care team, that our main role as pastoral care providers is listening. It's not about advice. It's about listening, about being a presence. And sometimes it's about sitting in silence with someone. Because ultimately, what listening is about is listening with the heart. It's not just listening with the ears. Sometimes touch is listening, touching with the heart. Speaking is speaking with the heart. It's not about speaking with the mouth, not about touching with the hands. It's doing those things from a position of a loving presence with another. And one of the wisest, someone once asked me, what's the wisest thing I know about cultivating relationships? And I don't know if wisest, this may be another not fully thought out position, but it's ask people questions about themselves. If you want to be connected, ask people questions about themselves. Most people like talking about themselves. So I ask people questions of myself. That can be a way of connecting. And that's what that unknown stranger did to Auburn. He asked her what she was doing, and she was able to recover from her drug addiction. She was separated from her abusive boyfriend, and her young baby that she was not sure was going to survive ended up graduating from Princeton in 2013. Now, not all stories have that happy an ending, but you never know the consequence of listening. You never know the possibilities by putting your heart out there in loving presence. Relationships are funny, and when we talk about identity, do we have an identity outside of a relationship? Are we always defined in our relationship with ourselves, a relationship with others, a relationship with the environment? When you think about identity in its very essence, it's about relationship. I think taking time to cultivate our relationships, getting into loving arguments, depending on how you do it, can strengthen relationships. Having respectful criticism can strengthen relationship. And one of the things I said in that video was, if you respectfully criticize me, it will not break our relationship. And I think that's why sometimes we are a little tentative in our relationships in Unitarian Universalism. We feel if we maybe critique or question someone, really explore their spirituality, ask them those deeper questions about their spirituality, not just accepting it. That's part of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Explore it. Are we willing to go there? Because it shouldn't break our relationships. Disagreement should not do that. And I mentioned earlier that I think there's three elements of the relationship. Our relationship with the planet that Chris talked beautifully about, and I talked a little bit last week in the Mercy service about it. And I think of our planet, what would it mean to have a covenant with our planet, a two-way promise? Well, it maybe can't be a covenant, because I'm not sure the planet really can promise us anything, but the planet does provide air and water and land. It's probably already fulfilled. It provides food for us. It's already fulfilled. It's part of the covenant. Do we really honor our side of the covenant in caring for the planet in a sustainable and appropriate way? I'm not sure we do. And our seventh principle calls us to respect the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are part. We're not over, we're not under, we are part of this interdependent web of all existence. That calls us to be in relationship with the planet, the interdependent web. And you look at climate change and what's going on in our world, I think we've been in an abusive relationship with our planet. And I was amazed to read in 2017, New Zealand, the country of New Zealand, granted legal personhood to the Whanganui River. They granted legal personhood to a river, and other countries have followed suit. And some people say, well, that's ridiculous. I think it's quite beautiful. We granted personhood to corporations in the 19th century. Who's more deserving of personhood, a sustaining river or a corporation? And that legal decision back in the 19th century in San Jose, I believe it was, resulted in corporations being able to give huge amounts of money to a political campaign and corrupting it. But we don't, the idea of personhood to a river can seem weird, but what would it mean if we started to grant these life-sustaining aspects of nature personhood? I think it's interesting to say, but I think we do need to renegotiate, rethink, and recultivate our relationship with the planet. Then our relationship with ourselves. What does I mean that? I don't know about you, sometimes I wake up and I'm just out of sorts. I'm grumpy, I'm angry, nothing's going to go right. My first thing, I forget to put the coffee pot in the coffee maker and coffee goes everywhere. I'm just out of sorts for some reason. And Mark Twain said that the worst loneliness is not to be comfortable with yourself. The worst loneliness is not to be comfortable with yourself. So what can we do? What spiritual practices? How can we get in better relationships with ourselves? Is it breathing? Is it walking? Is it cycling like many of us did yesterday for homelessness, which was a lot of fun. And many of you are here today as well. Not only 2 days at church, well done. Yeah. But that idea, how can we get comfortable with ourselves, feel good about ourselves? Not from an arrogance point of view, but recognizing that inherent worth and dignity of all people includes us. It's not just about others. And I mentioned it yesterday when we were cycling, that there's a science fiction book I read many years ago called Soul Walkers. And it's got this theory that the soul, a human soul, can't go any faster than a person can walk. And I listened to that and I realized that why there's so many soulless people in the airports. Because the soul hasn't quite caught up with them. I like to take that, the soul can't go any faster than you can cycle. I think sometimes we do feel out, and I think out of sorts. I think what we need to do is slow down. And I think one of the things the pandemic did maybe teach many of us was to slow down. There was just not that many opportunities to do things, and being able to just take a breath, to slow down, to be at home, allowed us to do that. And so I think there's some learning we can take about connecting and being in relationship with ourselves from the pandemic. And recognizing that we're human and we've got finite capacity and legitimate needs. And when we're in relationship with others, we need to express those needs and prioritize them. And Parker Palmer, the Quaker thinker, says spirituality refers to the eternal human longing to be part of something larger than one's own ego. Spirituality refers to the eternal human longing to be part of something larger than one's own ego. And I think that's why many of us come to religious community. Yes, to connect with one another, but to be part of something more, because we know we can do more together than we can ever do by ourselves. And I always like the idea of, taking something to the next level. I mean, many of us know the golden rule: treat others as you'd like to be treated. Well, there's this new idea of the platinum rule: treat others as they would like to be treated. Not treat others as you would like to be treated, but treat others like they would like to be treated. Because that demands that you be in relationship. Because I know, something, you could do something, I say, well, that wouldn't bother me. But if it bothers you, then I'm called through our covenant to address that. I remind you, when you look at others with your heart, not just your eyes, when you touch others with your heart, not just your hands, when you listen to others with your heart, not just your ears, then you are getting towards that platinum rule where you're understanding what that person's seeking, what you can do, like the person with Auburn who listened for 4 hours to this complete stranger on the phone. That person was listening with their heart. It did not matter they weren't in relationship. Someone needed their care and healing, and they were there to provide it. And in religious community, we come together and we each share parts of our heart with one another and take that piece of that other person's heart with us. And I was looking at the window this morning when it was rain, and I saw the 2 raindrops come down, and they would touch, join, and then part again. And I think that's what we do in our loving relationship. We take a little bit of each other with us. And as a religious community, Unitarian Universalists are guided by the spirit of love. Love is how we make another person feel, and everyone wants to feel seen. Everyone wants to feel listened to. Everyone wants to feel cared for. And everyone ultimately wants to feel valued and they belong here. And ultimately that is love.